June 24th, 1944, 08:47 hours, 8,000 feet above the volcanic rock of Iwo Jima. The early morning sky is a pale blue haze, the kind that makes distance deceptive and shapes hard to read. Warrant Officer Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most celebrated fighter aces, banks his Mitsubishi A6M Zero to the left. His hand is steady, his breathing calm, his mind focused, but his vision is not what it once was. Sakai scans the sky through one good eye. His right eye socket is a ruined cavity, sealed shut with scar tissue, an unhealed reminder of the day a .50 caliber round from a Grumman Avenger shattered half of his skull over Guadalcanal. Doctors said he would never fly again, but here he is, flying, fighting, surviving. Below him, 15 aircraft approach in perfect formation. Their silhouettes look familiar. Narrow wings, rounded noses, the clean aerodynamic lines that mark Japanese fighters returning from patrol. Sakai pushes the throttle forward. His Zero vibrates as it leans into a downward dive. But as he closes to 3,000 feet, his instincts jolt. Those silhouettes are wrong. The angles are sharper, the wings thicker, the presence heavier. These are not Japanese aircraft. They are American F-6F Hellcats, and they have already seen him. 4 Hellcats break formation instantly, banking outward before turning in toward him with surgical precision. They are climbing, cutting off his escape routes, moving not like individual pilots, but like a single coordinated machine. Sakai rolls his Zero inverted and dives, letting gravity tear him downward. The hunt begins. Just 2 years earlier, the situation was very different. In 1942, Saburo Sakai was a hunter, one of the most feared Zero pilots in the Pacific. Flying long-range missions from Rabaul over the Solomon Islands, he scored victory after victory. One of his most famous engagements came when he shot down an American F-4F Wildcat piloted by James "Pug" Sutherland, an encounter still studied today for its complexity and its symbolism. Back then, Sakai's squadron called him the Samurai of the Skies, a man whose instincts bordered on supernatural, a pilot who could sense an enemy's next move before the enemy even thought it. Combat was not effort. Combat was simply life. But on August 7th, 1942, everything changed. That day, Sakai spotted what he thought was a group of 8 Wildcats. In reality, they were Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers, bigger, slower, but each armed with deadly rear-facing .50 caliber machine guns. Sakai attacked from directly behind, the worst angle possible. A burst from a tail gunner smashed through his canopy. A single round tore into his forehead above his right eye, ripping bone and tissue from his skull. Shrapnel shredded his face. Blood filled his cockpit. His left side went numb. He could barely breathe. His Zero spiraled downward toward the ocean 4 miles below. Any normal pilot would have died, but Sakai was not normal. Through unimaginable pain, he forced his one working arm to pull the stick, leveling the aircraft just above the waves. He could not bail out. His parachute was destroyed. So he flew. For 4 hours and 47 minutes, Saburo Sakai flew back to Rabaul, half-conscious, blood-blind, and drifting in and out of shock. He navigated by the sun when he could open his eye. He passed out repeatedly. Only the Zero's natural stability kept him alive. When he reached Rabaul, his plane was so drenched in blood, the tower believed it was an American aircraft trying to land. Sakai landed anyway. He climbed out, delivered his combat report, and collapsed on the ground. Doctors operated for 5 hours without anesthesia because they feared he would die under sedation. They saved his life, but he would never see from his right eye again, declared unfit for combat. Sakai was sent to Omura Air Base to train new pilots. He was 27 years old, practically ancient by Japanese wartime standards, where many pilots entering service were 18 or 19, with barely 150 hours of flight time. Every day, Sakai watched young, inexperienced trainees depart for the front, and every day, fewer returned. He petitioned constantly to rejoin combat. His letters climbed through the hierarchy. Pressure mounted. And by April 1944, Japan's pilot shortage became so severe that command reversed their earlier decision. Saburo Sakai returned to combat with one eye, a rebuilt skull, and 64 confirmed victories. It would not be enough. As the situation on the ground shifted, another quiet battle unfolded behind the scenes, one that rarely receives attention in traditional wartime retellings. It was the psychological war, the war of perception, fear, and expectation. And for many commanders, this war was just as dangerous as the one fought with steel and gunpowder. By late 1944, both the Allies and Axis understood that controlling the narrative could mean controlling the battlefield itself. German commanders deployed deception tactics to mask troop shortages. Allied commanders, meanwhile, used intelligence leaks and controlled misinformation to misdirect German reconnaissance. It became a strategic chess match in which every false step, every miscalculated assumption could cost thousands of lives. Yet amid this invisible struggle, the soldiers on the front lines felt a far more tangible reality: the exhaustion of prolonged conflict. Many had been fighting for months, some for years. The cold, the mud, the hunger, and the constant artillery thunder carved deep marks on the human spirit. Still, they pushed forward, because by this stage of the war, every soldier understood something clearly. The end was coming, but no one knew how much more suffering the world would endure before that final moment arrived. Reports from frontline units describe an atmosphere of uneasy anticipation. Many soldiers spoke of entering ruined towns that were completely silent, unsure whether German troops were lying in wait or had already withdrawn. Buildings stood gutted. Streets were dark, wet, and eerily cold. Windows were shattered like broken teeth. It felt, as one veteran recalled, like walking into the ribs of a dead giant. The fighting that did erupt during these moments was often sudden, violent, and brief. Ambushes, sniper fire, and artillery strikes became the norm rather than large-scale engagements. This shifting battle style forced Allied units to adapt quickly, clearing houses one by one, securing crossroads, and establishing temporary command posts that sometimes lasted only a few hours. At the same time, German defenses grew increasingly fragmented. Many divisions were under strength. Some had lost as much as 60% of their manpower. Yet their commanders, determined to slow the Allied advance, used terrain and weather to their advantage, fighting from forests, hills, and fortified villages that had become makeshift strongholds. These were not battles of glory or grand maneuvers. They were battles of survival, and each one left a deep psychological impact on the men who fought them. For every kilometer gained, the Allies paid a price in blood, sweat, and heartbreak. Medics worked relentlessly, treating shattered limbs, frostbite, shell shock, and wounds caused by booby tracks left behind in retreating towns. Chaplains wrote letters home for soldiers who could no longer speak. Supply officers struggled to keep ammunition flowing across muddy, broken roads. Meanwhile, the civilian population, caught between shifting front lines, faced its own tragedies. Towns that had once been full of life now hosted makeshift shelters, burned homes, and frightened families carrying whatever they could salvage. Children trekked through rubble looking for missing parents. Elderly villagers begged soldiers for food. Entire communities were displaced within hours. War had erased the boundaries between military targets and everyday existence. As both sides pressed on, new developments began shaping what would soon become decisive turning points. Large-scale logistical movements were underway. Allied forces coordinated fuel convoys, engineering brigades, and armored columns, preparing for a renewed offensive. Intelligence reports highlighted weakened German defensive networks. Recon aircraft identified key gaps, noting locations where supply shortages were visibly slowing German operations. On the Axis side, internal fractures were widening. Some commanders argued for withdrawal to defensible positions. Others insisted on fighting to the last man. The tension inside the German high command created strategic contradictions. Units ordered to retreat one day were ordered to counterattack the next. This internal chaos, invisible to the frontline soldiers, slowly accelerated the momentum of Allied progress. But despite these gains, no one underestimated the enemy. The German war machine, even in its weakened state, remained capable of fierce resistance. Many towns became deadly choke points. Forested regions turned into natural fortresses. Every advance had to be earned. And soon, the world would witness one of the most dramatic shifts in the entire conflict. One that would define the final act of the war. As winter tightened its grip across Europe, the landscape itself became an adversary. The forests stood motionless, coated in frost so thick it muted the sound of distant artillery. Roads transformed into narrow veins of ice, and rivers slowed beneath sheets of frozen gray. For the soldiers, this bitter season became a constant reminder that victory, while closer, was still painfully far away. The advancing Allied armies soon realized that winter was not merely a backdrop, but a defining force that shaped every movement, every decision, and every moment of survival. It was during this period that the fighting took on a new rhythm, one defined by endurance rather than speed. Patrols ventured out cautiously, often navigating through snowdrifts that climbed to their knees. Machine guns jammed from the cold. Engines failed without warning. Even simple tasks, lighting a cigarette, cleaning a rifle, or boiling water, became exhausting. And yet, day after day, the soldiers pressed on. Many veterans later described winter 1944-45 as the moment when time seemed to distort. Hours felt like days. Days felt like weeks. The war moved slowly, but the danger never diminished. In these conditions, discipline became the key to survival. A single mistake, walking without proper spacing, neglecting to check a snow-covered path, failing to notice a freshly disturbed patch of earth, could trigger a mine, an ambush, or a sniper's bullet. Winter did not favor the attacker, and this made every Allied advance a costly achievement. Despite dwindling resources, the German forces fought with a determination born from desperation. They fortified ridges, dug trenches into frozen soil, and camouflaged gun emplacements with remarkable skill. Many units, though undersupplied and understrength, used the dense forests to stage clever delaying actions. These troops were not the powerful armored divisions of 1940, nor the rapid mechanized formations that swept across Europe during the early war. They were a patchwork of veterans, young conscripts, and Volkssturm militia, many barely trained, but driven by fear, loyalty, or a sense of duty. For them, every hour they delayed the Allied advance was, in their eyes, another hour won for their homeland. And at times, their resolve caught Allied units by surprise. Snipers preyed on any sign of movement. Mortar teams struck swiftly and vanished into the trees. Booby traps, disguised beneath snow, claimed countless casualties. This phase of the war was not defined by grand offensives or sweeping maneuvers. It was defined by attrition, slow, brutal, and unending. Even the smallest objectives carried enormous weight. A crossroads, a bridge, a cluster of farmhouses on a hill. Each became a battlefield. Each demanded coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery. Each carried a price measured in lives. When Allied troops succeeded, when they finally rooted out snipers, cleared mines, and raised their flag over ruined buildings, they did so with the knowledge that victory had been purchased at a cost invisible to the maps and reports. A frontline commander wrote in his journal, "We win ground by the yard. We lose friends by the hour." His words would echo through the memories of thousands of soldiers who endured that winter. By early 1945, whispers spread through the ranks. Whispers that the war might be nearing its climax. Whispers that the German forces were stretched thin, that internal cracks were widening, that their supply network was collapsing. But whispers alone could not ease the burden of those still fighting. The soldiers understood the paradox of the final months of war. The closer you get to the end, the harder the enemy fights. Like a cornered force with nothing more to lose, German units often resisted with fierce determination, hoping perhaps for a turning point that would never come. And in the midst of this final push, one question lingered in the minds of the Allied soldiers. How many more battles stood between them and home? As the winter dragged on, the war revealed its final, brutal truth. Victory was no longer about strategy. It was about endurance. The Allied soldiers pressed deeper into the heart of Europe, pushing through towns that had become nothing more than hollow shells of stone and ash. Each village carried its own scars. Each ruin whispered stories of families who had fled, resisted, or simply vanished. For troops advancing on foot, these frozen landscapes became an emotional maze as much as a tactical one. They could feel the war shifting. They could feel Germany weakening. But the danger, the constant, unrelenting danger lingered with every step. By this stage, Allied intelligence reports painted a clear picture. German divisions were fighting at a fraction of their intended strength. A regiment that should have fielded 2,000 men sometimes deployed fewer than 600. Panzer units carried tanks so worn down they broke tracks after a few miles. Fuel shortages forced commanders to abandon vehicles, artillery, and supply trucks on the roadside. Yet still, they fought. Some German soldiers clung to their posts out of obedience. Others fought for their comrades, and some fought simply because they saw no other path but resistance. What the Allies faced was not a coordinated, powerful army, but the last remnants of a nation unwilling to surrender. And those remnants still had the power to kill. Veterans later recalled that the final months of the war felt strangely unreal. You could march for hours without enemy contact, only to be ambushed inside a ruined barn by a handful of determined defenders. You could take a town with minimal resistance, then lose men to a single tripwire grenade hidden in a doorway. This unpredictability gnawed at the nerves of every soldier. The irony was unmistakable. The closer they got to the end of the war, the more they feared they might not live to see it. Letters home became shorter, hopes became quieter, and conversations between soldiers often ended with the same unspoken thought: just let me survive a little longer. Meanwhile, German logistical collapse was accelerating. Trains stalled on tracks that had been bombed beyond repair. Convoys lacked fuel to move supplies. Factories ran on half shifts, starved for raw materials. Even ammunition production slowed to a crawl. A captured German officer later admitted, "We had the will to fight, but no means left to fight with." This disparity between willpower and capability created a strange battlefield dynamic. Some German units surrendered immediately. Others launched desperate, reckless counterattacks, and a few fought to the last round, knowing surrender meant humiliation. The Allies never knew which they would face. It made every hillside, every forest, and every crossroads feel like a gamble with fate. By early 1945, something else became visible, something that soldiers could not ignore. Germany's civilian population was breaking. As Allied troops approached town after town, they encountered families carrying bundles of possessions on carts, elderly civilians waving white sheets from shattered windows, children digging through rubble looking for food, refugees moving westward in long, silent columns, searching for safety. For many soldiers, these scenes marked a turning point. The abstract idea of the enemy dissolved. In its place stood ordinary people caught in the gears of a collapsing empire. And yet, amid this human suffering, the war machine still clung to life, still capable of inflicting casualties, still determined to resist. The contradiction defined these final months. A dying army, a suffering population, a war that refused to end quietly. Despite exhaustion, the Allied command remained focused. They knew the decisive blow was nearing, but they also knew that the last phase would be the most dangerous. The river crossings, the push toward the industrial heartland, the battles for the cities that fed Germany's war machine. Each would demand planning, coordination, and sacrifice. The soldiers understood the path forward was narrowing. There was no turning back, no slowing down, no waiting for better conditions. They moved forward knowing the cost and hoping the end would justify the price. Spring 1945. The rivers of Germany, the Rhine, the Elbe, the Oder, stood as natural fortresses, stubbornly defending the heart of a collapsing empire. Allied troops approached with caution, aware that German forces would defend every crossing with relentless determination. Pontoon bridges were built under constant shell fire. Engineers worked through mud and freezing waters, while snipers and artillery rained down from the riverbanks. Every crossing became a test not only of courage but of precision, timing, and nerves. The Germans, though diminished in numbers, still had deadly traps prepared. Mines concealed under mud, barbed wire entanglements along riverbanks, machine gun nests hidden in ruined buildings and forest edges. For soldiers advancing under these conditions, the war felt like a calculated gamble. One misstep, one overlooked obstacle could mean death. Once across the rivers, the Allies faced the challenge of German cities. Unlike the open fields, towns and industrial complexes became deadly urban mazes. Snipers in ruined apartments, machine guns entrenched on rooftops, hidden explosives ready to destroy advancing armored columns. Each street corner became a potential ambush. Every building had to be cleared room by room, casualties mounted not from massed enemy formations, but from small, desperate groups of defenders. It was a different type of warfare, intensely personal, brutal, and psychologically exhausting. Soldiers later described urban combat as disorienting. The familiar patterns of movement, which worked in forests or fields, became useless. You never knew if the next doorway, the next stairwell, would contain an enemy ready to fire. Even as German resistance faltered, the human toll of these final battles was staggering. Allied forces encountered civilians trapped between the front lines and retreating German units. Hospitals overflowed with the injured. Food scarcity and disease compounded the suffering. Every step forward revealed the human consequences of industrialized warfare. The cost not only to soldiers, but to the people whose cities became battlefields. Yet, amid these horrors, acts of courage and compassion persisted. Soldiers carried wounded comrades, civilians hid those fleeing persecution, strangers shared what little food they had left. The war's final months were a testament to both the horrors of total war and the resilience of the human spirit. By April 1945, Germany's infrastructure was collapsing. Trains could no longer deliver supplies. Factories lay in ruins, either bombed or abandoned. Communication lines were severed. The German command structure was fracturing. Orders often went unheeded, delayed, or ignored entirely. Some units surrendered without a fight. Others launched desperate, last-minute attacks, knowing the war was lost. The Allies understood that the final victory was near, but also that the last fight could be the most unpredictable and deadly. For the soldiers on the ground, each town, each road, each river crossing became a final test of skill, courage, and endurance. April 1945. Berlin, the heart of the Third Reich, became a cauldron of fire, smoke, and desperation. Allied artillery pounded the city relentlessly, reducing streets and buildings to rubble. Every corner could conceal enemy snipers, booby traps, or last-ditch defenders. The Luftwaffe, once a symbol of German air power, no longer existed in any meaningful form. Soviet forces converging from the east faced not just the German army, but an entire city turned into a battlefield. Civilian refugees moved alongside soldiers, trying to escape death from both sides. Amid the chaos, German commanders issued fragmented orders, sometimes contradictory, as the city descended into confusion. Beneath the surface, Hitler and his inner circle huddled in the Führer bunker. Morale was shattered. Food, water, and ammunition were critically low, yet fanaticism persisted. Orders to fight to the last man were issued, though few could actually enforce them. The siege of Berlin was not just physical, it was psychological warfare in its purest form. Soldiers faced the horror of seeing their friends fall around them. Civilians confronted the reality of total destruction. The ever-present fear of Soviet reprisals amplified every moment of terror. Within the bunker, Hitler's mental state deteriorated rapidly. He became increasingly detached from reality, issuing impossible demands. Reports of incoming Soviet forces were dismissed as exaggerations. Even loyal officers began to understand that the war was lost, but the fear of disobedience and reprisal kept them trapped in a cycle of futile action. In Berlin, combat reached levels of intensity that were almost unimaginable: street-to-street fighting, house-to-house clearing, explosions from hidden mines and demolition charges. Every building could be a fortress, every basement a sniper nest, every corner a potential ambush. The Soviets, methodical and relentless, advanced block by block. German defenders used Molotov cocktails, sniper rifles, and even flamethrowers to slow the inevitable. Casualties on both sides mounted exponentially. Amid this chaos, civilians, many of them children, were caught in the crossfire. Hunger, disease, and bombardment made survival a daily struggle. The urban environment magnified the brutality of total war. April 30th, 1945, Hitler, facing the collapse of his regime and the inevitability of defeat, made his final decision. In the Führer bunker, he committed suicide. Eva Braun, his companion, died alongside him. The symbolism was absolute. The Third Reich, which had once threatened the world, ended in a confined underground bunker beneath a devastated city. Berlin continued to burn. German forces, leaderless and disoriented, either surrendered or fought desperately in isolated pockets. The Allies and Soviets pressed forward, determined to bring an end to the nightmare. May 2nd, 1945. Berlin falls. Remaining German forces surrender to the Soviets. The once mighty German army, reduced to fragmented units, had no choice but to lay down arms. Across Europe, German commanders followed suit. May 7th, 1945. The official surrender is signed in Reims, France. May 8th, 1945. Victory in Europe Day, VE Day, is celebrated. The war in Europe, which had consumed 6 years of human life, finally ends. The final months of the European theater demonstrate the immense human cost of industrialized war. Millions of soldiers and civilians dead. Entire cities leveled. Survivors left to rebuild in landscapes scarred physically and psychologically. The story of Berlin's fall is a stark reminder. Victory in modern warfare requires not just courage, but systems, logistics, coordination, industrial capacity, and sustained operational planning. Individual heroism matters, but only within the context of broader, systematic execution. The fun barely breaks through scattered clouds above the Pacific. 8,000 feet over Iwo Jima, Warrant Officer Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most accomplished aces, banks his Zero fighters sharply to the left. But today, he fights with a severe handicap. His right eye socket is empty, sealed by scar tissue, a relic of a .50 caliber round that tore through his skull over Guadalcanal 2 years prior. That shot should have ended his flying career. Doctors declared it impossible. Yet here he is, scanning the sky through his one good eye, nerves taut, instincts razor sharp. Below him, 15 aircraft approach in tight formation. His mind calculates instinctively. The silhouettes appear correct. Japanese fighters returning from patrol. Sakai pushes the throttle forward, the engine whining, diving to join them. At 3,000 feet, his stomach drops. The truth hits. These are not his countrymen. They are American F-6F Hellcats. 4 of them break formation, turning directly toward him, climbing aggressively to cut off his escape. The impossible has arrived. Sakai has been fighting since 1938 in China, with 64 confirmed aerial victories to his name. He has never misidentified an enemy aircraft, but today, with one eye and permanent depth perception loss, everything is uncertain. 2 years earlier, he was the hunter, a predator of the skies. August 1942, over Guadalcanal, he shot down one of the most famous Wildcats flown by James "Pug" Sutherland. Squadron mates dubbed him the Samurai of the Skies, able to predict an enemy pilot's moves before they knew them themselves. Combat was second nature, instinct, precision, art. Then came August 7th, 1942. A formation he thought were Wildcats turned out to be Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers. He approached from directly behind, the most vulnerable angle. A .50 caliber burst tore through his canopy, shattering bone and brain. Paralysis struck his left side. Blood flooded the cockpit. His left arm hung useless. The Zero spiraled toward the ocean, 4 miles below. Through sheer force of will, he pulled back on the stick with his one working arm, arresting the dive at wave-top level. 4 hours and 47 minutes later, he limped across 600 miles of ocean. navigating by the sun with partial consciousness. When he landed at Rabaul, the tower waved him off, mistaking his bloodied Zero for a damaged enemy fighter. Sakai completed his mission report, then collapsed. For 18 months, he trained new pilots at Omura Air Base. By 1944 standards, at 27, he was ancient. Most pilots were 19, with less than 200 hours of flight time. Finally, desperation forced the Japanese Navy's hand. Sakai returned to combat with one eye and his 64 victories. The 4 Hellcats that approached him that day moved unlike any opponent he had ever faced. Where 1942 Americans fought individually, these pilots operated as a coordinated organism. When Sakai rolled left, 2 Hellcats anticipated his move. When he pulled up, another blocked him. His Zero still outturned any American fighter at low speed, but it was not enough. The chase was brutal, airspeed dwindling to 180 knots, too fast to stall, too slow to escape. Throttle to the stop, nose down, trading altitude for speed. The Zero reached 320 knots. The Hellcats overtook him at 360. Mathematics dictated the outcome. Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, 2,200 horsepower. Nakajima Zero engine, 1,130 horsepower. The Zeros could outturn, but never outspeed them. Sakai fought cloud cover, diving to near structural limits, evading the Americans for 23 minutes. Finally, they broke off. He survived, not because of skill alone, but because 4 pilots chose not to finish him. 3 days later, June 27th, 1944, Sakai leads 6 Zeros on combat patrol. They are ambushed by 16 Hellcats, diving from 6,000 feet above, coordinated to strike from multiple angles. The results are devastating. 8 Zeros in another patrol are destroyed or fleeing within 4 minutes. Sakai's group struggles to survive. Individual skill, courage, instinct all matter little against overwhelming numbers, coordination, and systematic training. Sakai shoots down 1 Hellcat, his 64th and final confirmed victory. Even then, more waves of Hellcats arrive in reserve. The Americans could rotate pilots, maintain patrols for hours, and afford reinforcements. Japan, in contrast, could not sustain operations, and each pilot's life had a sharply limited statistical value in the larger conflict. By August 1944, Saburo Sakai had been promoted to ensign and transferred back to mainland Japan. The promotion was ceremonial, a hollow acknowledgement of survival rather than achievement. Sakai was assigned to Yokosuka Naval Air Base, where his role shifted, evaluating captured American equipment, analyzing tactics, and writing reports. The Japanese had captured exactly 1 Hellcat, a damaged F-6F-3 forced to land on a Philippine beach. Engineers tore it apart, examining everything. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, capable of 2,200 horsepower, running 1,200 hours between overhauls. The hydraulic systems and gun synchronizers, precise, reliable, standardized. The cockpit radios, allowing pilots to coordinate in flight with real-time updates. Japan's best fighter, the Nakajima Homare, produced 1,990 horsepower, but required overhauls every 100 hours. Production numbers revealed the stark reality. 12,275 Hellcats, produced between 1943 to 1945. 10,449 Zeros produced in the entire war, 1940 to 1945. Pilot numbers were even more alarming. America, 82,000 trained pilots, 600 hours of training before combat. Japan, 3,800 pilots, often only 100 hours of training by 1944. American carriers launched fighters fully fueled, returned pilots for meals and rest. Japanese pilots launched knowing many flights were effectively one-way missions. Armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, bullet-resistant glass, all standard for the Hellcat. Zeros? Minimal. A single .50 caliber hit in the wrong location was often fatal. Sakai studied captured American training manuals. The lessons were chilling. Pilots fought in pairs. One bait, one cover. Wingmen protected each other. Standardized tactics, formations, contingency plans, all codified and repeatable. Japanese pilots, by contrast, relied on individual mastery and the Bushido spirit. Experience was lost when a pilot died. Individual valor mattered far more than repeatable results. Sakai's painful realization: one exceptional Japanese ace might shoot down 10 Americans, but tomorrow 11 planes would arrive, and the day after 12, then 15. Individual victories meant little against the American war machine. The Hellcat pilots who spared Sakai that day over Iwo Jima were not merciful, they were indifferent. In America's eyes, the death of one crippled Zero was statistically irrelevant. August 6, 1945, Hiroshima falls. August 9, 1945, Nagasaki is destroyed. August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announces Japan's surrender. Sakai, sitting in the ready room at Matsuyama Air Base, listens with 9 other pilots. Some weep, some sit in stunned silence. He feels neither surprise nor grief. He had known defeat long before Hiroshima, the outcome already inevitable against overwhelming systems. 3 days later, August 18th, Sakai leads his remaining Zeros on one final mission. American B-32 Dominator reconnaissance aircraft photograph Tokyo Bay. Sakai initially misidentifies them as B-29s. It does not matter. He fires his guns in a single attack pass. These are the last combat shots of World War II. Both B-32s make it back to Okinawa. One American photographer is killed, the final Allied combat casualty of the Pacific War. Landing back at Matsuyama, Sakai climbs from his Zero. He vows never again to kill, not even a mosquito. In the post-war years, Sakai becomes a Buddhist acolyte, starts a printing business in Tokyo, writes his memoirs, Samurai, published in 1957, a bestseller translated into multiple languages. American pilots who had faced him in combat later wrote to him. Some became friends. 1976, Sakai meets Harold Jones, a former U.S. Navy Hellcat pilot. Jones reveals he had been in one of the formations that engaged Japanese fighters over Iwo Jima in June 1944. "You might have been shooting at me," Sakai says. "Might have been. Good thing I missed," Jones replies. They laugh, a shared humor only survivors can understand. Sakai dies September 22, 2000, honored at a U.S. Navy dinner for former combatants. Sakai's 64 victories immortalized him as a legend, but history reveals a harder truth. America's 12,275 Hellcats won the war. Japan's individual warriors, no matter how skilled, could not compete with industrial systems. The F-6F Hellcat may not have been superior in every maneuver, but it was part of a well-oiled war machine. Logistics, pilot training, standardized tactics, mass production, replacement systems. Sakai's story illustrates a fundamental principle of modern warfare. Tactical brilliance can be defeated by systematic superiority. In total war, systems defeat warriors. Individual heroism is remembered, but victory belongs to the nation that organizes, trains, and equips its forces as an integrated machine. The sky over the Pacific had never been so unforgiving. For Saburo Sakai, the war had become a harsh teacher, not of skill, not of courage, but of systems. One man, no matter how talented, could not overcome the combined might of industry, logistics, and coordination. Every dogfight he survived, every miracle landing of his Zero was a fleeting triumph against an unrelenting machine. By August 1944, Sakai was back on the mainland, promoted to Enin, a rank that offered no power, no honor beyond survival. He spent months analyzing captured American aircraft and training manuals. One F-6 Hellcat, salvaged from a beach in the Philippines, revealed the brutal truth. 2,200 horsepower, armor plating, self-sealing fuel tanks, standardized radio systems. Every American pilot was trained for hundreds of hours, taught to fight as a pair, a formation, a system. Each move, each tactic, precise, practiced, repeatable. The Japanese pilots fought with spirit, with courage, with what they called Bushido. But spirit alone could not match a mechanized, industrialized war machine. Sakai began to understand why the American pilot had spared him over Iwo Jima. It was not mercy. It was mathematics. One crippled pilot in an obsolete fighter was irrelevant. Numbers, systems, and preparation mattered more than any single act of bravery. He had survived, not because he was the greatest pilot alive, but because the Americans had other priorities. He had been spared by the indifferent calculus of industrial warfare. Then came August 1945. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Japan surrendered. Sakai, sitting quietly with his fellow pilots at Matsuyama Air Base, felt neither shock nor grief, only the quiet affirmation of what he had already known. Even in his survival, he had seen the truth of the war. The individual could not win against a system built to endure and replace. On August 18th, in one final act of service, Sakai and 9 remaining pilots launched in their Zeros. Their targets, American B-32 reconnaissance planes. It would be their last combat, their final shots in a war that had already ended. Only one casualty resulted: an American photographer, the last Allied combat death of the Pacific War. And when he landed that day, Sakai made a vow. Never again would he take a life. His fighting was over. In the years that followed, Sakai became a Buddhist acolyte, a businessman, an author. His memoir, Samurai, became a global bestseller. Former adversaries became friends. In 1976, he met Harold Jones, a Hellcat pilot from 1944. "You might have been shooting at me," Sakai said. "Might have been," Jones replied. "Good thing I missed." They laughed, the kind of laughter only survivors could share. When Saburo Sakai passed away in 2000, he did so on an American naval base, honored by the very pilots whose industrial might had once hunted him across the skies. His 64 victories immortalized his skill and courage. Yet history would also remember the 12,275 Hellcats that had helped bring the war to an end. The lesson was clear. Tactical brilliance could create legends, but systems, coordinated, relentless, and scalable, won wars. The story of Saburo Sakai is more than the tale of a remarkable pilot. It is a timeless lesson in strategy, preparation, and the balance between individual skill and collective strength. The samurai of the sky may have fought with unmatched courage, but in the end, it was the industrial, organized, and relentless system of the Americans that decided the outcome of the Pacific War. And now, as we reflect on this extraordinary journey, from miraculous survival to final surrender, from the lone Zero to the might of the Hellcat, we are reminded that in history, as in life, preparation and strategy often outweigh raw talent. But courage, resilience, and the human spirit, those are the stories that endure. If you found Saburo Sakai's story as compelling as we did, and want to explore more untold histories and deep dives into World War II, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. There are countless lessons waiting in the past, and every one of them has a story worth telling.